Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you guys enjoyed the last one. I'm trying my best to film and get videos uploaded on a daily basis, just depending on my daily plans and what I got going on. Um, I do have a part-time job, so it does kind of make it a little harder to find the day to come and record. But thankfully today I don't have to work, so I can take care of that. But then, let's get back into it. For those who don't know, this is The Sickness is a System: How Capitalism Fails to Protect Us from Pandemics or Itself by Richard Wolff. It's a fantastic read, I personally think, so far. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let's get back into Chapter 3. So, in contrast, liberals and social democrats who accept the concept of race have mostly sought to ameliorate the sufferings of the unemployed and poorer by policies such as education, welfare, and training. Such policies, likewise, rarely succeeded either generally or enduringly. They cannot overcome the system's reproduction of poverty and unemployment and the imposition of them disproportionately on the shock absorber races. Both conservatives and liberals have enforced a shared denial of the mechanisms of mutual support between capitalism and racism. Of course, capitalism is not the only cause or source of racism, but ignoring or minimizing its role only perpetuates racism. By designating some members of society to be shock absorbers of recurring business cycles, the capitalist system creates legacies of trauma and inequality that can accumulate into dysfunctional qualities for its victims. There is neither need no warrant to take those qualities as givens, nor to transform them into racialized attributes. The solution is rather to treat those legacies as among the profoundly unacceptable consequences and costs of capitalism's profoundly divisive inequality and instability. A capitalism that perpetuates itself via racism incurs huge self-protection costs to police and imprison, or to provide some safety nets for its shock absorber races, or varying combinations of both. When capitalists shift from some or all of those costs onto the tax obligations of workers, more social tensions emerge. Workers are then told their tax payments must compensate for the deficiencies attributed to the shock absorber races, rather than to the structural irrationalities of capitalism. Racial conflicts then preclude or tear apart working class political unity. Racism persists in no small part because its benefits to capitalism outweigh its cost, or at least those costs capitalists have to bear. When capitalists and their ideological supporters disavow racism, they carefully ignore capitalism as a key part of the problem. They point instead to the intolerance of some people who lack compassion for the less fortunate. Thereby, they further divide the working class, in effect, into one race that cannot or will not work hard, and is therefore unemployed and poor, and another race that lacks compassion. In comparison, capitalists and their supporters congratulate themselves for their superior morality. Capitalism thus comes full circle. Its supporters use and benefit from a racism whose practice and consequences they blame exclusively on others, but never on capitalism itself. Next part in here, the capitalism racism partnership. In the wake of W.E.B. Du Bois' 150th birthday, his works offer a lens through which to assess U.S. capitalism's relationship to racism today. He famously wrote, "Capitalism cannot reform itself. It is doomed to self-destruction." While adding that in the U.S., race would be a key issue in that process. Thus, he would have had much to say when, around last Memorial Day, Trump suggested that NFL players peacefully protesting police killings of black people did not belong in the country. An extreme right-wing capitalist agenda prevails. It pushes private capitalist goals privatization and deregulation, tax cuts for corporations and the rich, and subsidies for them to lengths not seen before. A kind of unhinged capitalist euphoria makes a virtue of learning nothing about restraint from the catastrophic booms and busts associated with the 1929 and 2008. Capitalism's headlong rush is quite logically symbolized and figureheaded by Trump. Yet what makes it possible is above all the absence of any serious, organized opposition such as the successfully mounted during the Great Depression by the New Deal coalition of industrial unions, two socialist parties, one communist party, After 1945, Republicans and Democrats abetted the demise of the New Deal coalition and subsequent efforts to rebuild it. That allowed a capitalist resurgence and thereby the resumption yet again of another drive to crisis. When that happened in 2008-09, the absence of a serious left opposition precluded anything like another New Deal. After 2008, we had only bailouts, much bigger than FDR's in the 1930s. Oblivious to capitalism's history, today's centrist Democratic Party leadership waits for Trump's demise so it can resume the Clintons' legacy, another drive to crisis. While no broad-based national opposition yet exists in the U.S., there are signs of it struggling to be born. Public school teachers, some without union support, became active finally against years of public school funding. Cutbacks accelerated under the grotesque DeVos administration. The striking teacher success in West Virginia showed what serious, organized opposition can do. Likewise, the high schoolers from Parkland formed organized opposition to gun lobby, mocking the fakeries and lip service of so many others. Consider too the proliferating organizations of and for worker co-ops as a democratic alternative to undemocratically organized capitalist enterprises. There are more examples, but what matters basically is this. Social change requires serious, organized opposition to the status quo. The further the social change seeks to go, the better organized its proponents within that serious opposition need to be. Defeating a particular politician takes less organizing than defeating a political party, and that, in turn, takes less than making a transition to a better, different economy. Du Bois understood that capitalism's drive to self-destruction would eventually prompt last-ditch efforts to save the system. We see these now in the sorts of extreme deregulation, tax cuts for businesses and the rich, etc., undertaken by the Trump regime. The bubble and subsequent recession to which they're building, plus the extreme income and wealth inequalities that they worsen, are signals of impending serious opposition. So too are the efforts to distract attention from system critique and toward selected scapegoats, none white immigrants especially. Revulsion is building towards the smokescreens of hypocrisy, racism, and nationalism, barely masking capitalism's ongoing failure to provide the jobs and incomes people need. Du Bois split his political efforts between appealing to African Americans to embrace anti-capitalism and to socialists to embrace anti-racism. In his view, no program to establish socialism in the U.S. could succeed or survive so long as African Americans were kept as employees or unemployed. Likewise, no program to abolish racism was possible within the U.S. capitalist system. Racism in the U.S. had settled deeply into the economics, politics, and culture of the U.S. since its inception. It had adjusted itself to capitalism and vice versa. Their interdependence or partnership was deeply structured. Thus, for example, U.S. capitalism could use racism to solve the problems of two of its worst features: instability and inequality. The business cycles ever besetting capitalism threatened the entire working class with periodic unemployment, poverty, etc. That constant threat, as well as the recurring downturns themselves, risk provoking working class opposition to capitalism as a system. Racism facilitated offloading instabilities, risks and cost onto the African American community. That was last hired, first fired. A large part of the white population could thus escape capitalism's instability or suffer less from it. Racist arguments then blamed African Americans for their unemployment, in part by contrasting it with that of most whites. Racism and capitalism reinforce one another in this way. In parallel fashion, capitalism's incessantly rising inequality threatens the entire working class with relative and often also absolute poverty. Racism assigns African Americans to the bottom of the income and wealth distributions via racist hiring, housing, schooling, public policies, and attitudes. Many whites feel less threatened by capitalism's drive to ever greater inequality because a disproportionate share of that inequality is dumped onto an African American community. Whites have a constant exhibit of "it could be worse," flowing from that community's living conditions. A partnership between anti-capitalism and anti-racism within social movements and in public discourse could dissolve the mutual reinforcement between racism and capitalism and thereby advance progressive social change. Today's capitalism includes contradictions pushing toward that dissolution. Long-term wage stagnation and profit-driven technical changes are subjecting more and more whites to conditions previously limited largely to African Americans. Hence, the household disintegrations, drug dependencies, etc. Long afflicting African Americans are increasingly suffered among whites as well. The resurgence of white supremacy represents anxiety about descent into conditions that capitalism and racism had earlier let most whites escape. It is the other side of whites recognizing their basic employee position within capitalism as shared with African Americans. Capitalism's current development, the rush to privatize, cut taxes, export jobs, automate, etc., drives conservatives, not just Trump, to cultivate white supremacy against the growing working class solidarity the system itself generates. In the light of Du Bois' concept of capitalism's self-destruction, my today's polarizing politics, Trump, ideologies, culture, and economy, be it multiple sides. Onward. How capitalism has screwed women over. It's been 1 year since the explosion of the Me Too movement that followed allegations against Harvey Weinstein. Since then, the hashtag #MeToo hashtag has been used around 19 million times to expose and discuss workplace sexual harassment. Women are raising their voices. The struggle is multifaceted, but at its heart, women want economic and political equality with men. They also are increasingly questioning capitalism, the system that has allowed and maintained their subordination. To understand how women have been systematically denied so much of what capitalism has provided to their male peers, we need to go back to a pre-capitalist stage. Before capitalism, there is feudalism, a social structure in which most people, serfs, worked for and answered to lords, who in return granted them land and protection. There was often little or no use of money. Lords did not hire workers. Instead, the subordination was personal and church-sanctioned. People were tied to the land on which they were born, and there wasn't the separation we take for granted today between work and home. When the transition from feudalism to capitalism began, starting in the 17th century, England, before spreading globally, enthusiastic supporters promised a new economic system would bring the individual freedom, equality, social solidarity, and democracy people longed for. The slogan of the French Revolution that overthrew feudalism was liberty, equality, and fraternity. To this, the American Revolution added democracy. For men, capitalism meant escape from belonging to a lord, being tied to the land, and from rigid hierarchies. Now, they were free to sell their labor to whomever they wanted, without any moral or religious obligation. They relished their escape from feudalism, even as they found themselves trapped within capitalism's employer-employee relationship. But most women were excluded from even the limited benefits that men enjoyed. Capitalism didn't provide decently paid employment for both men and women. The solution was to insist that women stay at home. The man's wage plus a woman's work in the home meant no mass of paid jobs needed to be available for women. Capitalists also managed to avoid paying for the child care that produced their future employees. At home, women cooked meals, cleaned rooms, clothes, and dishes, repaired furniture, provided healthcare and childcare. They worked like feudal serfs. Men's lives navigated daily between household feudalism and workplace capitalism. Exploited by capitalists at work, men could, in turn, exploit their wives at home. It's women's subordination to households that has produced many of the inequalities, discriminations, and abuses women are protesting to this day. Over the last century, huge numbers of women started to work outside the home, led by poorer women. World War II saw large numbers of women entering the workforce. Then in the 1970s, automation and globalization ended the long tradition of rising real wages in the U.S. So women entered the workplace to bring more money to the family. And in doing so, they often shouldered the burdensome double shift of home and work. Women also tended to be funneled into pink collar jobs, such as retail, nursing, or teaching, which were paid less. All the while, across workplaces, women had to deal with the men's competitive anxieties. This often manifested itself in men's attempts to extend household inequality to the workplace. As the Me Too movement makes clear, they still do, and the costs are heavy. But as women fight for equality with men, many have realized that the ultimate problem is not the men. Rather, it is the system that has positioned men and women in an unequal economic relationship with employers that affects all the other aspects of their relationships. There is a movement of women who want more than just to work alongside men within a capitalism that continues to subordinate and exploit them both. To do that requires that we reorganize how we run homes and businesses in ways neither capitalist nor feudal. Instead, workplaces can be organized as democratic communities. One person, one vote decides all the key workplace matters. The premise of such worker co-ops is that the democracy Americans endorse for politics belongs as well in economics. Such a change could free women and men from being trapped in the system that serves neither. In modern capitalism, governments routinely borrow money. They do this to finance budget deficits that occur when governments raise less in taxes than they spend. Government debts as class swindles. But governments also borrow to invest in long-term projects of economic development. The swindling occurs when the lenders and borrowers, usually private financiers and career politicians, negotiate loans that serve their own particular interest at the expense of the taxpayers, who eventually cover the cost of repaying the government's loans plus interest on them. If governments raised enough taxes to cover their desired levels of spending, they would not need to borrow. But taxes imposed on the wealthiest corporations and individuals would be the most equitable strategy. The corporate wealthy protest, of course, threatening that if taxed, they might reduce their contributions to the economy, investing less. Most government politicians sympathize with these protests. Many come from the ranks of the wealthiest corporations and individuals, or aspire to join them. They share similar ideologies and depend on on donations from them. Complying politicians typically exaggerate the negative aspects of taxing corporations and the rich. They rarely compare them to the negative effects of the alternatives, taxing middle and lower income people more or cutting government spending. Government borrowing to cover budget deficits has its own negative effects on the economy. Many variables influence the impacts of taxes and deficit borrowing. Because those variables' effects cannot be known or measured for years into the future, no one can know which is better or worse for the economy in the long term. When the corporate rich and their political allies stress the negative effects of taxes on the rich, they usually carefully neglect the other side of the story, as when advertisers mention only the positive side of whatever they are paid to promote. Their goals are simply more profits and less taxes. The class swindle goes deeper than one side of the untruths about taxes. This becomes clear when we identify who lends to borrowing governments. Banks, big corporations, the 5% wealthiest individuals, and other governments are the chief lenders. They are the same economic groups, excepting foreign governments, that press for and get tax cuts such as the Trump GOP tax reduction of 2017 December. That particular tax cut increased for the federal budget deficit to over $1 trillion in 2019. The same politicians who facilitate tax reductions for banks, big corporations, and the wealthy individuals likewise then facilitate government borrowing money from them. The class window embedded in government borrowing is the none-too-subtle mechanism whereby the richest sectors of modern capitalism avoid or replace taxes levied on them with interest, borrowing loans to the same government. What a deal for the rich, who thus exchanges taxes, assets lost, for loans, assets and good income gained, and what a deal for their political servants, Leaders who can spend more money to buy votes and secure donations without having to tax anybody because they can borrow instead. And by the time the massive taxpayers watching all this crap, the swindle perpetrated upon them, those leaders have moved up their political ladders. Their replacements will then respond to popular anger by ostentatiously raising taxes less or maybe even cutting them in favor of yet again borrowing. As this can get kicked down the road, its explosive potential builds. Deficit finance. The polite veneer for this swindle deepens inequality in the United States and everywhere else it is practiced. It redistributes wealth from the mass of people, taxpayers, to the richest who save by means of lower taxes and then invest those savings in government loans. And transferring money from the many to a few, deficit finance operates like a lottery. A different but parallel sort of swindle occurs when governments, especially in emerging economies, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so on, borrow from banks and other lenders in the advanced industrial economies. Here the perpetrators are, on the one side, bankers and the other lenders agree to make profitable loans to foreign governments. On the other side are government politicians eager to borrow. The latter's eagerness follows from two sources. The first is the need to secure their political careers by funding economic development projects that cannot otherwise occur because those politicians fear the electoral results of using taxes to pay for the projects. The second is their ability to divert, legally or otherwise, sizable portions of the loans they procure to invest themselves and their parties, in addition to, or even instead of, their development projects. These lenders and borrowers gather easily inexpensive hotels to negotiate wondrous development loans, nicely serving both their needs. The loans are backed, of course, by the borrowing country's ability to tax its citizens and or sell its natural resources or sell its government operation to pay off the loans and the interest on them. Given such loans high profitability, they can and often do run for years before outraged local citizens revolt and refuse to keep paying. Then the government declares bankruptcy, amid threats and lamentations on all sides. Eventually, what remains of the loan is partly or wholly forgiven. No problem. The lender's profits were already reaped, the career benefits achieved. Soon the whole process begins again. The organization and manipulation of government debts to finance budget deficits and development projects have been core components of world capitalism's real history for centuries. The system fosters those swindlers. The system also rejects or ignores the critics of those swindles, including modern monetary theorists, Marxists, and populists of varying persuasions. Change comes when finally the swindle's critics and its victims merged to end it. Onward. The rush to get Americans back to unsafe workplaces. I want to talk to you about the accelerating rush to put America back to work, or to get the economy going again. Phrases like this are coming from the president and from leading CEOs I want to warn you about. I want to make sure you know what's going on. And what's going on here is understood. We have a government and a private sector that failed catastrophically to prepare for this vile pandemic. The companies that make the masks, the ventilators to test the gowns and hospital beds, etc., didn't produce what we need, didn't import what we need, nor did they stockpile what we need around the country. They failed, and so did the government that is supposed to compensate for the failures of private capitalism. Government failed because it so blindly supports private capitalism, believing that what is privately profitable is also socially efficient. And I'm talking about both Republicans and the Democratic Party establishments. So we've had a lockdown because Americans are dying at a scale we've yet to see anywhere else. And what is the response? Well, there are efforts to get the testing done. They're late, they're slow, and most of all, they're insufficient. The same is true of everything else. Beds, ventilators, you name it. And in this situation, not only are there no object apologies by the leaders of a system so spectacularly failing, but it's worse. There is now a rush for people to get back to work. That's what the reality is beneath the lofty phrases, getting us back in gear and restarting the economy. Capitalists have discovered an odd economic lesson. You can have all the machines in the world, the latest technology, the glittiest factories, but they are all worthless items unless human beings, workers, are in there using them, applying them, and making things happen. So, capitalists need workers. The reverse, not so much. Everything those capitalists have, the machines and buildings and technology, who make them? Not those capitalists. Workers. That's right. The capitalists realize they need workers, but the workers are all at home because they don't want to die from dangerous workplace conditions. They don't want to get the virus and infect their partners, children, elder neighbors, and extended friends. But the capitalists need profits, and you can only get that if the workers are working. So now the rush is on. Make the workers come back, plead with them, beg with them, tell them it's patriotic. To them, tell them it's their duty. Force them by telling them that they won't get their unemployment check anymore, or their jobs back, and so on. But don't be fooled. The failure of the capitalists isn't over. Most of them have done absolutely nothing in this moment to make their workplaces safer. Does the workplace have an ongoing testing department, adequately equipped and staffed? Adequate testing doesn't just happen once. The testing has to go over and over again at every workplace, or else you are at risk. What about the masks? What about the ventilators? What about the beds? What about sick leave so that you can be taken care of if you get sick? Has everything been reconfigured so you're at least 6 to 9 feet away from the next person? In the bathrooms? At lunch? Before you change your clothes? Have they done all that? Have they taken the steps? Who is going to monitor this? But above all, because it's capitalism, have they paid for it? Most capitalists haven't done it. They don't want to do it. They don't want to pay for it, but they want you to come back anyway. How surprising. It's unconscionable to pressure people to choose between going without a job on the one hand or risking their lives on the other. This choice exists because corporations don't want to spend the money to do what has to be done, such as ongoing testing and tracing of people who test positive, constant disinfecting, and the reconfiguration of workplaces to accommodate social distancing. None of that has been done adequately, and until it has, you should not accept being forced to choose between a job or your life, especially not when the only thing holding us back from safe workplaces is corporate money. There are movements all over the United States, groups of workers here and there, not willing to go back and risk their lives and all that are for families. There's even talk of a general strike, is when a whole working class says to the capitalist, no, we will not work under the conditions you're trying to impose upon us. It's happened before in history, and it's something all of us should be thinking about now. If this rush to get us back to work continues, we are being asked to risk our lives to make profits for the capitalist class. Do you really want to be a part of that? Whether or not a workplace opens has to be decided by all the people involved, not just by the corporate leadership at the top. They call all the shots and they make all the decisions because that's what the word employer means in capitalism. If you ever wanted a demonstration of how unacceptable and undemocratic capitalism is, we're in the middle of it now. This ought to be a democratic decision. All workers are taking a chance if they go back to work, and all workers are taking a chance if they don't go back. Therefore, all workers should have an equal voice in deciding whether and when it's safe to go back. It's unacceptable to have some bosses tell you, in effect, to risk your life because they were too cheap to make it safe. This is not just a virus problem, and it's not just an economic crash. We are being brought face to face with the fact that capitalism is undemocratic and capitalism is now threatening our lives. It's time to change the system. All right, guys, we're going to end it there. I'm hoping to finish chapter 3 in the next video or two. But just a quick little, debrief, which I might try and do at the end of every video. It's just absolutely right. The Me Too movement really exposed the exploitation of women in the workplace. Sexual harassment, abuse, it's disgusting. It shouldn't happen, period. In my perspective, I think Hollywood and liberal elites and conservatives do have hijacked that message, have hijacked the purpose of us trying to make a change in equality for both. And it's wrong. And of course, this last part I just read, ties straight into the idea of, oh, we need money because our company's struggling, but yeah, we got $1 billion we're not going to spend to make people safer, and instead we're going to take those bailouts and lay people off. It's hypocrisy. So, hope you guys enjoyed, and leave a comment down below for any questions or any recommendations, and guys have a great day.